Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. My name is Andrew Ibarra, and in this video, we're going to be walking through the global settings file. I'll be explaining the different properties and configurations that you can do within global settings, which essentially dictate the way that your EPAC instance interacts with your Azure environment. The global settings file is the backbone of how EPAC deploys and handles your Azure policy resources, meaning if you're trying to deploy to a subscription or a management group that's not explicitly defined within your global settings file, then it won't work through EPAC. Also, this video will be one of the longer videos, so I'll be putting the timestamps down below that'll help you immediately jump to the different topics that I'll be covering. So let's start off by picking up where we last left off, which was creating an empty folder of the folder structure that we use from the starter kit on our GitHub site. And rather than editing the files here, what I'm going to do is open this up within VS Code. And if you're unfamiliar with VS Code, it's a free code editor that I'll put the link in the description down below. So within VS Code, let's go to File, Open Folder, and let's look for the folder where we last created the EPAC skeleton. And if I open this up, you'll notice on the left-hand side, we have an Explorer that shows the exact same folder structure. But now when we click on, in this case, the global settings file, which what we're going to be manipulating throughout the rest of this video, you'll notice that it opens up within VS Code itself. So starting from the top down, the schema on line 2 is a property that links to a file that's published through EPAC that essentially helps you fill out the global settings file. So for example, if I was to update line 11, which is strategy from owned only to my name, for example, you'll notice it throws a warning that if I hover over it, it says the value is not accepted and the valid values are full and owned only. And the way it knows this is based on line 2, the schema that's published online. So it's best practice to keep it that way. As you're filling this out, you know that you're doing something incorrectly, or maybe you're missing a property that's needed for the global settings file. pacOwnerId on line 3 is EPAC's way of identifying which policy resources are owned through you, through your pacOwnerId, versus what's manually deployed or maybe deployed through another instance of EPAC. So for simplicity purposes, we highly recommend you just put a GUID here. It's not required. You can put your name or your email if you prefer, but ideally just to prevent any interactions with other pacOwnerIDs or just to keep it unique, we highly recommend using a new GUID. And if you're unfamiliar with how to create a new GUID, obviously you can manually do it by just replacing some of these values. Or if you want to open up a new terminal within VS Code, here at the very bottom, this will open up a PowerShell terminal. If you type in new-GUID and hit enter, it will automatically create one for you. This unique string of characters, which you can copy and replace here, which I'll do for the rest of this video as well. Next on line 4, we have pacEnvironments, which for the remaining of the global settings file is this property alone. Each pacEnvironment is essentially a set of scoped subscriptions or management groups or Azure resources that you want to deploy your Azure policy assignments to. So rather than in each and every policy assignment, you declare all of these different properties, you declare it here within global settings, and then in the policy assignment file, you just reference each of these different pacSelectors. So for simplicity's sakes, I'm going to remove the second instance. And if you're following along with me, pacEnvironment for the first one is line 5 through 17 here. And the second one, which is down here. And again, I'll just delete this just so that we focus on one for the time being. So within each pacEnvironment, you have a pacSelector, which is going to be the name of this pacEnvironment. You can name this whatever you want, but what I typically recommend is to name it something that's relative to the environment that you're trying to deploy policy resources to. So for example, if you're trying to deploy everything to the tenant, I would replace this with tenant or maybe EPAC tenant. Likewise, if you're trying to deploy to dev or maybe multiple instances of dev, you can name this EPAC-dev1 or dev2. Or production, EPAC-production. I think I'll leave it up to you to make what makes the most sense for your pacSelector. Next, we have cloud on line 7, and this is where you declare if you're using an Azure commercial cloud or a government instance. We have the full list of allowed values on our website as well as inside of the schema. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to be deploying to an Azure commercial cloud, so I leave it on Azure Cloud, which is commercial. Next, for line 8 on tenant ID, you replace this value with your tenant ID that you're trying to manage Azure policy with. So the easiest way to find this is multiple ways, but I prefer to go through management groups. So here in the Azure portal at the very top, if you search management groups, it'll take you here, and it's going to be this ID that's associated with your tenant root group. I think you can also find it through EntreID, but specifically because we manage Azure policy a lot through EPAC, I prefer going through management groups to see the full list. So just replace this value with your current value for the tenant ID that you're trying to manage Azure policy with. deploymentRootScope on line 9 is where you want this specific pacSelector to initially make contact and start managing Azure policy at a top level. And what I mean by that is line 8, where we declared the tenant ID. This does not mean that we're going to be managing Azure policy across the entire tenant. If you prefer that, you would take this ID and replace it here on the deploymentRootScope at the end of this provider path. So here, by doing this, we are now managing Azure policy for this pacSelector across the entire tenant. But maybe that's not what you want. So if we take a look at an example in Visio, if we are setting a pacSelector deploymentRootScope at AZ policy rather than the tenant root group, we will be starting by looking at this management group and down. So when it runs, it's only going to be able to see policy resources like assignments, exemptions, custom definitions at this management group and below, meaning it won't be able to see what's inside of AZ testing and this management group or at the tenant root group level. If you're trying to deploy to both AZ policy and AZ testing, you would have to either create two separate pacSelectors, so one for AZ policy and one for AZ testing, or just one pacSelector at the tenant root group that sees everything below. Depending on your situation, you'll have to test around and see what makes the most sense for you. Just to further the understanding, I'm going to walk through populating this with one of my real management groups. So if I pull up the Azure portal and I want to deploy to AZ policy this specific management group, I'll copy the ID of this management group, go back inside of my global settings, and for this pacSelector, update here. And just to make sure it's more aligned with best practice for the pacSelector, I'm going to update this one to actually say AZ policy. So now whenever I run my pipeline for my pacSelector AZ policy, what this is essentially saying is whenever it logs into the tenant, this specific tenant ID, I want you to start looking and managing Azure policy at this specific scope, this deploymentRootScope. And this deploymentRootScope is AZ policy in this case, meaning I'm only going to be looking at and managing Azure policy at this management group and this subscription down below. And now maybe this is where you might be thinking and slightly getting ahead of me is when it comes time to assign a policy, not at that management group, but at this subscription within it, you do this within the assignment itself, and I'll be covering that in an upcoming video. Just so that you understand the syntax of the deploymentRootScope, it has to have the full provider path of the resource you're trying to deploy to. So for management groups, the provider path is always going to be /providers /Microsoft.Management /management groups, and then followed by the ID of the management group. Alternatively, if you're trying to set the deploymentRootScope to a subscription, it's going to look slightly different to where instead of this full path, the provider path is going to be subscriptions, followed by the ID of the subscription. Just so that you understand if you're trying to set it up and it may be not working for you, the correct syntax matters depending if you're using management groups, subscriptions, or resource groups. And I'll have the full list down in the description below. Up next on line 10 is the desiredState property, which holds some of the more important sub-properties that dictate the way that your pacSelector interacts with your Azure environment. The number one most important property within all of this pacSelector is the strategy property. And the two options are full, which will, when it runs for the comparison of what's inside of your folder structure compared to what's inside of your Azure environment, if it's set to full, it will look to see and delete anything that's not part of your folder structure, meaning any policy assignments, any custom definitions or custom definition sets, or any exemptions that are not part of this folder structure here on this left-hand side. It will output that it will delete them if it notices it's not part of it. Alternatively, the other option is owned only, and this will be the option that it will coexist and not interact. It won't delete, it won't update, it won't do anything to the current non-EPAC deployed policy resources that are already existing inside of your environment. On line 12, we have the keepDfcSecurityAssignments, and that stands for Keep Defender for Cloud Security Assignments. If you were to go into Defender for Cloud and migrate to security policies, you'll see a full list of different standards like the Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark or other regulatory compliance policies that you can enable. As a byproduct of toggling these from off to on, it will deploy an Azure policy for each of these. So rather than having Defender for Cloud maintain and deploy a handful of policies, you could take these exact same policies and put them through EPAC. And if you'd rather have EPAC be the source of truth, instead of having to have Defender for Cloud and EPAC both deploy the same policies, you would set this to false. Therefore, EPAC knows to delete those policies whenever it runs and does the difference for you. Line 13, we have doNotDisableDeprecatedPolicies. And there will be some instances where you might be referencing a built-in initiative, such as the Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark or any of those regulatory compliance policies that we looked at. Every now and then, there might be one or two that at one point was valid, but for whatever reason is no longer valid. The Azure policy team and the engine should be setting those to disabled as the effect goes, meaning it's no longer going to be auditing or should no longer be auditing or doing any type of enforcement. But sometimes it falls through the crack and doesn't set those to disabled. So we essentially have a catch-all called Do Not Disable Deprecated Policies. Having this set to false or on decides if you want to keep those deprecated policies either in the current effect or set them to disabled for you automatically through EPAC. On line 15, we have globalNotScopes. And this is essentially a way to declare if there's any scope within your pack environment that you do not want policy assignments being applied to or policy resources being managed. So as an example, if I was to go to this specific one that we currently set up, so the pacSelector for AZ policy, let me migrate back to management groups. And let's say within it, we have one subscription. So may not be the best example, but should still be valid. Let's say the policy test subscription, we don't want policy assignments being applied to. You would take that subscription ID and put it here inside of globalNotScopes, and it has to be the full provider path. Meaning, in this case, for subscriptions, it's /subscriptions /the GUID. And that should be how you declare that specific subscription you don't want your policy assignments being applied to. On line 19, we have the managedIdentityLocation property. And the way that Azure policy works when it comes to remediation policies are the policy assignments themselves have to have an identity associated with it that has a permission to do whatever remediation or change on your Azure resources. And those identities that are associated with your different Azure policies all have to be aligned to some location with an Entra ID. So for me, it's East US 2 based on my tenant, but you can obviously update this for whatever makes the most sense for you. And that's it. So just to recap where we completed this pack environment, we named the pacSelector AZ policy purely because the management group that we wanted to start managing Azure policy with was called AZ policy. We set the cloud to Azure cloud, which is the commercial cloud, which is the one I'm using. We updated the tenant ID, and then within it, we said once we hit that tenant, this is the exact management group or the exact deploymentRootScope that we want to start managing Azure policy resources with. And we filled out the rest of the properties. But now let's create another pacSelector or maybe two more just to see different scenarios with, instead of managing at the management group level, let's target a specific subscription just to see what that will look like. So I'll typically just copy the already made one that we just went through and use it as a template. So let's start by filling out the pacSelector and let's look at what we currently can update. I have a production subscription that I want to target. And for me, I'm going to name this one CAF production just because I might have multiple instances of this specific subscription. So I'll name this one CAF-production. And it's still going to be an Azure cloud. Still the same tenant ID, but now for deployment root scope, I'm going to update this to be the full path for subscriptions, which in this case is /subscriptions, and then followed by the GUID. And then I'll go ahead and leave the remaining properties the same as far as desired state goes, but let me clean up the globalNotScopes as this subscription no longer applies to us. And now you have two pacSelectors. So when it comes time to creating your assignment files, you can reference both these pacSelectors when it comes to where you want to assign policy to. Keep in mind that having two or multiple pacSelectors within the same tenant doesn't always mean best practice. For example, if you were to wanting to deploy policy to both AZ policy and CAF production, you would have to run the steps for generating the plan, the difference of what's inside of your repo to what's inside of the environment, twice. So you would have to run it for CAF production to actually do the difference and then deploy it, as well as another set of commands to do the AZ policy pacSelector and then deploy it to there. And ideally, if you want to simplify it as much as possible, using the management group structure like tenant root group, where it can see everything, would be a more simpler approach to where you would just have to run the difference once. And within the assignments file, you dictate where you want your policies to be assigned to. We'll cover that on the next video where we actually start creating a policy assignment. And I'll show you how you can target specific subscriptions or management groups within one of your pacSelectors. The last thing I want to call out is the tenant ID for both of my pacSelectors are the same because I'm deploying to the same tenant. But maybe on your scenario, you might have multiple tenants. You might have a dev, a non-production, and a production. If that's the case, you can use global settings to configure each of those tenants all within one file. And that allows you to have a centralized location within the EPAC folder structure, within this repository of all your definitions and your policy assignments. And then you use global settings to distribute them amongst all the different tenants. And that's it for this video. So on the next video, we're going to be creating custom definitions, custom policy sets, and assignments, and then taking those and referencing the global settings to actually deploy it into your Azure environment. Keep in mind, you do need access to each of these different global settings that you configure. So for your pacSelector for AZ policy, for example, if you're trying to manage and deploy Azure policy to it, you do need permissions for the user that you're logging in to actually make those changes into the environment. So look forward to seeing you in the upcoming video. Likewise, at any point, if you have any additional EPAC content you would like to see, please leave a comment down below. It helps us know which ones we need to prioritize as far as releasing videos and content for the community. But in the meantime, thank you so much for watching and look forward to seeing you in the next video.